On the morning of March 3rd at exactly 9:14 a.m., I found a white envelope waiting on my kitchen table, centered perfectly, as if someone had measured the distance from every edge. The label was printed in a stark, almost clinical font. Financial Reallocation Proposal, signature required, O. Davis. My son's name. I slid a finger beneath the seal, and the paper inside crackled sharply, like it resented being touched. His signature sat boldly under the figure. $740,000. Money they intended to redistribute, as if my life were a ledger and not the home I had built for decades. Before I could process the audacity of it, my phone buzzed with a bank alert. Transaction failed. I tried again with the utility payment standing beside the humming refrigerator, the same one Harvey and I bought the year Omar left for college. The message repeated. Account access restricted. My own bank card frozen. My own bills locked away from me. And all of this, every insult and invasion, unfolded just hours before the reading of my husband Harvey's will. I stood holding that envelope, its weight far heavier than paper, and a single thought settled over me like cold fog. How could they do this to me? If this moment stirs something familiar in you, stay with me. What comes next is the truth I carried in silence for far too long. I'm Allison Davis, 62 years old, a retired schoolteacher who once believed that patience could soften any hard edge in a person. For 30 years I stood at the front of classrooms filled with restless children, coaxing order out of chaos with nothing but a steady voice and a practiced calm. When Harvey built his woodworking shop behind our house, I became the one who held everything else together. Schedules, bills, meals, homework, repairs, holidays, all the invisible threads that keep a family from fraying. Harvey used to say I had a mind like a ledger and a heart like a stove. Warm but disciplined. Reliable. It wasn't a grand compliment, but it suited me. I never needed much more than ordinary peace. My childhood was simple, my dreams modest. A home where people felt safe, useful, and seen. For the most part, that was what I built. Our children, Omar and Jade, grew up believing their lives would bloom without limits. I encouraged that. I didn't want them pinned down by fear or circumstance the way I once felt. I taught them to read early, took them to the library every Saturday, and saved for years to send them to summer programs, sports clinics, anything that might widen their world. Back then, they treated me with an affection that felt unbreakable. They called me every day from college, if not for advice, then for the comfort of a familiar voice. They needed my recipes for Harvey's roast chicken, my reminders about FAFSA dates, my signature on their apartment leases, my proofreading on their resumes. Omar's voice when he was young had a restless warmth to it, like he was always hurrying toward the next thing. "Mom, I'll swing by after class," he'd say, and then he'd appear at the door with laundry, an empty gas tank, or a request for help with some complicated form. He never questioned whether I would say yes. I rarely did. Jade was gentler but sharper. She inherited Harvey's eye for detail, along with his ability to assess a room in seconds. Even as a teenager, she'd noticed the shape of a scratch on our hardwood floor, or the faintest smell of smoke from the woodshop. When she went to art school, she'd send me photos of every small success. A published sketch, a displayed installation, a design she sold for grocery money. She used to joke that I was her first audience, safest critic, and forever editor. Back then they called me the heart of the family. Back then they loved the way I held things together. Now when they speak of me, in clipped emails, scheduled calls, or tense meetings, they use words that don't belong in any family conversation. Financial factor. Risk profile. Depreciating asset. Their language has the tone of consultants discussing a failing property, not children speaking of the woman who carried them, fed them, taught them to take their first steps, and sat through every illness and heartbreak. It didn't happen all at once. Like most fractures, it began as a hairline line running silently beneath the surface. I first noticed the shift the year before Harvey died, though I didn't want to name it then. Omar had started working with a group of investors who specialized in environmental retreats, sustainable luxury experiences, as he called them. He spoke a new dialect, one heavy with terms like scalability, leverage, and projected yield. He said them with the bright eagerness of someone who believes he's finally discovered the language that will unlock success. Jade, meanwhile, moved from art into design consulting, floating between jobs that promised quick growth but demanded everything in return. Long hours, constant networking, and the unspoken rule that sentimentality was a liability. When they visited, they seemed unusually interested in the land surrounding the house. They asked questions Harvey and I had never heard from them before. The age of the trees, the boundaries on the survey map, the zoning restrictions on the woodland behind the shop. At the time, I mistook it for curiosity. Children grow up and see the world differently. That is natural. That is expected. But there was a moment, small, sharp, and quiet, that I should have paid attention to. We were in the kitchen after dinner, the room still smelling of onions and leftover rosemary. Jade wiped her hands on a towel and said, with a casualness that felt rehearsed, "Mom, you do understand that your house can't just sit here after everything." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Something in her tone shifted, just enough to reveal a different motive beneath the surface of her words. Her expression was too cool, too calculating for someone talking about her own mother's home. I didn't confront her. I simply nodded, set a plate in the drying rack, and changed the subject. The moment slipped away like a draft in the hallway. Almost imperceptible but unmistakably cold. Looking back, that was the first true crack in the foundation. The second came not long after Harvey passed, though at the time I was still moving through those heavy days when grief makes everything feel muffled and indistinct. The children came less with condolences and more with questions, lists, and suggestions that sounded more like directives. They spoke as if the house and land were assets in waiting, pieces on a board they were preparing to move. Their once familiar voices now carried a different rhythm, one I recognized only later as entitlement wearing the thin mask of concern. I suppose this is the part where I say I should have noticed sooner. But the truth is simpler. When you love someone, you misinterpret the warning signs because you want to believe the best of them. You mistake ambition for enthusiasm, pressure for involvement, calculation for care. And by the time the truth comes into focus, your name is already printed on envelopes you never asked for, stuck to documents you never agreed to, paired with dollar figures that reduce a lifetime of devotion into a line item. I didn't know then that their voices would eventually go cold. I didn't know that the language of love could so easily be replaced by the language of acquisition. But I know it now. A year before everything unraveled, I stood at the kitchen counter slicing pears for a tart. The house was quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and the low hum of the dishwasher. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that slips by unnoticed unless something interrupts its stillness. Jade had come over unannounced, stepping into the kitchen with that confident stride she inherited from Harvey. She wore a blazer that didn't suit her age and spoke in a tone that didn't suit our relationship. "Mom," she said, running a finger along the windowsill as if checking for dust, "you do understand that your house can't just sit here after everything." She let the sentence drift away, suspended in the air like a cobweb catching the light. I kept slicing, though my hands slowed. The knife made a soft tap each time it met the cutting board, steady but tentative. I searched her face, trying to read whether this was worry, practicality, or something colder. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, she scanned the room as though assessing square footage, imagining possibilities, weighing value. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She shrugged a single shoulder. "It's just things change. People move on. Spaces need to be repurposed. You shouldn't have to maintain all this alone." Her gaze drifted toward the backyard, where Harvey's workshop sat beneath the cedar trees. "It's a lot for one person." Her words might have sounded caring to a stranger. To me they felt rehearsed, too polished, too distant. I recognized the cadence of someone softening an unpleasant announcement. Still, I convinced myself she meant well. Children grow. They see life differently. They try to be practical. But something sharp pressed under her tone, and I felt it. I placed the slices into the bowl and wiped my hands on a cloth. "I'm fine here," I said gently. "This house is part of my routine. I'm not planning to make any sudden changes." Jade nodded, though her expression tightened just slightly, as if I had given the wrong answer on a test. She walked through the dining room, touching the back of chairs, glancing at the framed photos on the wall. When she paused at the picture of Harvey holding her on his shoulders, she didn't smile. She only studied it, her face unreadable. "You know," she added, "there are people who would love this property. Investors. Designers. Anyone with vision." It was an odd choice of words. I felt the air in the room cool. I tried to brush it aside. Grief was still raw then, and maybe she didn't know how to talk around it. Maybe she needed control to feel safe. That's the story I wrote for her in my mind. It seemed kinder than assuming the worst. Later that evening, after she left abruptly, 2 quick kisses on my cheeks, her perfume lingering in the hallway, I walked through the house with slow steps. The floors creaked under my slippers. The late light settled across the furniture Harvey built, turning each piece golden. I touched the arm of the rocking chair he carved the year Omar was born. I touched the edge of the dining table where we hosted 22 Thanksgivings. Every corner held the warmth of our life. It struck me then how Jade had looked at the house not as a home, but as an opportunity. That night I couldn't sleep. The refrigerator hummed steadily in the dark kitchen as I made tea. I sat at the table and replayed her words until they blurred. Something had shifted. A thin splinter had worked its way under the surface of our family, and though it didn't bleed yet, I felt the pain of it. In the morning, I found a text from her. "Thanks for yesterday. Let's talk about long-term plans soon." Plans for whom? And decided by whom? Still, I silenced the unease. I told myself she was processing loss in her own way. I told myself she worried about my future. I told myself many things to avoid facing the truth that pressed softly but insistently against me. She was looking at my life as if it were a project. A few weeks later, Jade returned with Omar. They stood in the backyard, pointing at the workshop, the slope of the hill, the old oak that Harvey once trimmed every spring. I watched from the window as they talked in low, purposeful voices. Jade gestured broadly. Omar nodded, hands in pockets, eyes narrowed in concentration. When they noticed me watching, they smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. "Inside," Jade said. "We're just brainstorming possibilities. Don't worry, Mom." Her tone was light, but her posture was firm, confident, already claiming space. I forced a smile. "Brainstorming about what?" "Nothing concrete," Omar answered. "Just ideas. Ideas. Plans. Possibilities." Words stacked like stones closing a path. I didn't push. I didn't question. I was still too tender from loss, too accustomed to peace, too willing to believe the best of them. The first crack had opened, thin as a hair. I stepped around it, pretending it wasn't there. But the house knew. The walls felt different, as if listening. The air held a new tension, quiet but undeniable. Looking back, that was the moment I should have paused and listened to my instincts. That was when I should have looked directly at the fracture forming beneath my feet. But love makes you overlook the smallest shifts, even when they are the ones that end up breaking everything. After Harvey died, the house seemed to breathe differently. The mornings were quieter, the air heavier. I moved through the rooms softly, the way people do when they're trying not to wake someone who is no longer there. I thought my children would fill some of that silence, but instead, their presence brought a new kind of noise, sharp, purposeful, and strangely urgent. Their calls began changing first. Not "Mom, how are you holding up?" Not "Do you need anything?" Instead, "Did you check the land appraisal yet? Send photos of the garage. We need to assess the structure. You're not planning to stay here forever, right?" Each question sounded as if it had been rehearsed, as if they were reading from a list someone else had prepared. Always practical, always impatient. Their voices didn't carry the softness of children comforting a grieving parent. They had the clipped tone of people moving toward a goal. First, I chalked it up to stress. Grief makes people strange, I reminded myself. But within weeks, their visits took on a pattern that was hard to ignore. They started arriving unannounced, sometimes separately, sometimes together. Each time stepping into the house with an energy that made me feel as though I no longer lived there but was merely borrowing space. Omar would stride straight to the backyard without removing his shoes. Jade would open cabinets as if verifying inventory. They moved items, shifted furniture, opened closets, and took pictures of every room. The clicks of their phones echoed through the house like quiet verdicts. One Sunday morning, as I stirred oatmeal on the stove, they appeared at the door carrying clipboards. Actual clipboards. I stared at them, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "What are those for?" I asked. "Just notes," Omar said. "For planning." "Planning what?" He didn't answer. He simply stepped past me and began measuring the hallway. Jade followed with a tape measure, stretching it across the dining room table. murmuring numbers under her breath. She brushed past the framed photos on the wall. Wedding pictures, birthdays, harvest dinners, without a single pause to look at them. "Hold this," she said at one point, pressing the end of the tape measure into my hand before I understood what she was doing. My own home had been repurposed into a project site, and I had been assigned the role of an assistant. At the funeral, the shift was even more jarring. I stood near Harvey's casket, accepting condolences from neighbors and former students, when I heard Omar whisper to his partner with an enthusiasm a grieving son shouldn't possess, "This place is pure potential." His partner nodded, glancing around the property like a scout identifying land for acquisition. I felt a coldness settle under my ribs. Later that week, Jade sent me a spreadsheet outlining property optimization pathways. The subject line read, "For review when ready." As though I were a client. As though my home, the one Harvey and I built board by board, were a portfolio waiting to be rearranged. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a walk through the woods behind the house, the leaves crackling under my boots. Harvey had always loved these trees. He once told me that the forest was like a choir, every branch, every bird, every gust of wind adding its own voice. That afternoon, the woods felt strangely quiet, as though they sensed something coming. When I returned home, the living room light was on. Omar and Jade stood by the mantel, examining Harvey's old blueprints spread across the coffee table. "You weren't answering," Jade said, not looking up. "We let ourselves in." I noticed that she had removed 2 of Harvey's hand-carved figurines from the shelf and placed them aside as if they were in her way. Omar was marking notes directly onto the blueprint with a red pen. "This isn't a good time," I said. "It's the perfect time," Omar replied. "You need support with decisions. We're stepping up." Stepping up. That was not what it felt like. What it felt like was slow encroachment, like a tide rising against the foundation of my home, inch by inch. Not sudden enough to cause alarm, but steady enough to make the ground feel unstable. One evening, while sorting through Harvey's tools in the workshop, I overheard them outside. They must have assumed I had gone inside. Omar said, "If we push the timeline, we can start by fall." Jade replied, "She won't fight it. She hates conflict. We'll present it as a practical solution." I froze with Harvey's old level in my hand. It was heavy, worn smooth from decades of use. I set it down gently as if it were listening. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold in my hands. The refrigerator hummed softly, the same familiar sound, but it didn't comfort me. It only reminded me how everything around me remained steady, while my children were shifting into people I barely recognized. I wished I could say I confronted them then. I wished I could say I drew a line and protected myself. But grief fogs the mind, and love blurs the edges of betrayal. Instead, I told myself what any mother tells herself when her children behave in ways that wound her. They don't mean it. They're overwhelmed. They're planning too fast because they miss him too much. But deep down, a quiet truth began forming. A truth I tried to ignore. They weren't planning for my well-being. They were planning for my removal. And they were doing it with the confidence of people who believed the house, and everything tied to it, was already theirs. The morning of the will reading felt heavier than it should have. I woke before the alarm, long before the sun had softened the edges of the house. The quiet had a weight to it, like the air before a storm. I made coffee out of habit, but it tasted wrong, metallic, as if the bitterness in my mouth had seeped into it. I dressed slowly, choosing the navy sweater Harvey always liked, the one he said made me look steady as a lighthouse. I did not feel steady. Still, I folded the collar neatly and slipped the brass workshop key into my coat pocket without thinking. It had hung by Harvey's workbench for decades. That morning, I needed something of his close to my hand. The law office sat on the corner of Pine and Everett, a low brick building with windows that reflected the dull sky. Inside, the waiting room smelled of lemon polish and old paper. I took the seat closest to the wall and folded my hands in my lap. I could hear the faint tick of the clock, too slow, too calm for the way my chest felt. When Omar and Jade walked in, their steps were brisk, purposeful. They didn't sit beside me. Instead, they positioned themselves across the room, speaking in low, clipped tones that stopped whenever I looked up. Their partners hovered behind them, silent but observant, as though waiting for instructions. At exactly 10, the attorney, Mr. Kelman, opened the door. "Mrs. Davis," he said with a respectful nod. "We're ready." We took our places, me alone on one side of the table, the children opposite me as though we were two parties in a negotiation. The folder before him held Harvey's handwritten will. I recognized the curve of his letters through the paper, and something inside me tightened. As soon as he began reading, the interruptions began. "Just summarize that part," Omar said after the first paragraph. "We don't need the sentiment. Focus on the assets," Jade added, tapping her pen impatiently. They interrupted 22 times. I counted because I needed something to hold on to, something to steady the shaking inside. The moment we reached the section about the workshop and the land surrounding it, Omar stood halfway from his chair, as if unable to wait. "Before we continue," he said, pulling a leather folder from his bag, "I need to introduce some documents." He laid them on the table with the confidence of a man unveiling a plan already set in motion. At the top of the first page, bold and unmistakable, Eco Haven Retreat LLC. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then the words beneath it sank in: projected development site, Davis property. I looked up. They were watching me, eyes bright with a kind of anticipation. "This is the company Jade and I have been building," Omar said. "We've already listed the house and land as primary assets." "Listed?" I asked. My voice came out softer than I intended. "It's just preliminary," Jade said quickly. "All very standard. But for efficiency, we need to move the property into temporary custodial management." She slid another document toward me, her nails tapping lightly on the signature line. "This makes everything easier." The paper was thick and smooth, almost elegant, as though meant to impress rather than inform. My name was printed neatly at the bottom above a blank line. "Temporary custodial transfer of property rights," I read aloud. "It's not giving anything away," Omar insisted. "It centralizes control. You'll still have a room, of course." "A room?" "In the house where I raised them, where I taught them to read, where I held Harvey's hand as he built his first cabinet." My throat tightened, but my voice stayed even. "You've made plans without me." "It's what Dad would have wanted," Jade said. "To create something profitable. Something lasting. We're honoring his vision." I stared at the single line meant for my signature, thin as a vein. Harvey wanted family, not profit. They didn't respond. Instead, Omar nudged the pen closer to me with the faintest push of his finger, as if the decision should have been obvious. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. More like a hinge that had been bending for too long finally locking into place. "No," I said quietly. The air in the room stilled. "I won't sign," I added. "Not this. Not anything like this." Jade's mouth tightened, the way it used to when her teachers corrected her. Omar's jaw clenched hard enough to show the muscle twitch in his cheek. Their partners looked away, embarrassed or irritated. I couldn't tell which. The silence stretched. Heavy. Revealing. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my children. I was looking at people who had come prepared to take something from me. And it felt unmistakably like losing Harvey all over again. After the will reading, I drove home slowly, keeping both hands on the wheel even when the road was empty. The winter light lay flat across the fields. I felt as though the world around me had been drained of color. Pale sky, pale earth, pale future. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked unchanged, but it no longer felt like mine. It felt like a place someone had already planned to repurpose. I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I walked toward Harvey's workshop, the small wooden building tucked between two cedar trees. The door stuck slightly, as it always had, and I had to lean my shoulder into it to open it. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and old varnish, steady, comforting scents that had soaked into the walls over years of labor and laughter. The afternoon light filtered through the high window, catching on floating specks of dust. Harvey's workbench was still covered with tools he had used in his last weeks. A chisel wrapped in cloth, a wooden mallet, a half-finished frame. He had always kept the space tidy but never sterile. Every object had its place, every mark had a purpose. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence settle around me. It wasn't empty silence. It was the kind that holds the shape of someone who's gone. My eyes drifted to the small shelf above the bench. On it sat Harvey's old pocket flashlight, dented, scratched, held together by tape at the base. He kept it nearby because he never trusted the overhead lights. He said they flickered too much, the way some people flicker when they're not telling the truth. I reached for the flashlight, feeling its familiar weight. When I pressed the switch, the beam sputtered, flickered twice, then steadied into a thin, trembling line of light. It illuminated the grain of the old cedar boards and the dust floating like faint stars. That flicker, one moment weak, the next steady, hit something inside me. Because that was exactly how I had been living these past months. Flickering. Weak one moment, steady the next. Hoping things would settle. Hoping my children would soften. Hoping the house would stay a home and not become a prize. But standing there in Harvey's workshop, I saw everything clearly. The interruptions, the questions, the measurements, the documents, the pressure. All of it was not confusion or grief on their part. It was intention. It was ambition. It was entitlement. They weren't helping me through loss. They were preparing to move me aside. The realization didn't come violently. It didn't shatter anything. It settled quietly, like dust returning to a surface it had always belonged to. And I understood finally fully that if I didn't protect what Harvey and I built, no one else would. I turned off the flashlight and closed my hand around it, the metal warm from my touch. It felt like a small anchor, something steady, something mine. No more, I whispered into the room. My voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It simply existed, steady, like the beam of the flashlight after its flicker. I stepped outside and stood on the path, breathing in the sharp scent of cedar. The trees swayed slightly in the wind as if listening. I reached into my coat pocket and touched the brass key I had taken with me that morning. I didn't know why I had taken it then, but I understood it now. It was time to stop waiting for my children to do right by me. It was time to stop believing their intentions were harmless. It was time to stop letting other people decide the future of my home. I looked at the house, the workshop, the surrounding forest, the life Harvey and I had shaped together. For years I had loved quietly, managed quietly, endured quietly. But quiet is not the same as weak. Quiet is simply how I move. And now it was how I would fight. I slipped the key back into my pocket and closed the workshop door with a firm, final push. The sound echoed, soft but final. That was the moment, though I didn't say it aloud, that I made my vow. I will not be moved out of my life. I will not be erased from my own story. I will not hand over what was entrusted to me. And just like that flashlight, flickering then steady, I felt something in myself click into place. A steadiness I thought grief had stolen returned. A sense of direction. Quiet decision. I would protect what was ours. And I would do it with the same calm precision Harvey used when carving a piece of wood, patient, deliberate, exact. This was the moment the tide began to turn, though they didn't know it yet. The next morning began with a thin line of pale light slipping through the kitchen blinds, cutting across the table where Harvey and I had shared hundreds of quiet breakfasts. I sat with my hands around a mug of weak tea, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my palms, steadying myself. Grief had made me slow, but clarity made me deliberate. I moved through the house with a calm I hadn't felt in months, as though I were returning to a part of myself I had nearly abandoned. I walked to the grandfather clock in the hallway, its pendulum swinging with the same patient rhythm it had kept for decades. Harvey had maintained it himself, oiling the gears once a year, listening to its tick with the kind of reverence some people reserve for hymns. I opened the back panel and slipped a small camera inside, angling it toward the living room. It blinked once, armed ready. I wasn't planning for confrontation. I was planning for record. I needed truth preserved in something other than memory. I closed the panel gently, the wood clicking into place like a quiet agreement. The next step required more than resolve. It required precision. I drove to Mr. Kelman's office, the same building where I had felt so small the day before. The lemon polish smell still lingered in the halls, but this time I didn't feel swallowed by it. I sat across from him, my posture firm, my hands folded neatly. "I'd like to move forward," I said. His eyebrows lifted. "With what we discussed yesterday?" "With more," I replied. He nodded slowly, as though he'd been waiting for this. He opened a fresh file, pen poised. I explained what I intended: the formation of an independent community foundation in Harvey's name, one dedicated to woodworking education, forest preservation, and community programs. A foundation built from the values Harvey had lived every day, not the values our children had turned toward. It has to be airtight, I added. Protected from sale, from redevelopment, from any transfer. It can be, he said. But it must be done immediately. The hours that followed blurred together in a quiet, steady rhythm of signatures, verification, notarization, and documentation. My hand cramped once, but I continued determined. Every paper I signed felt like reclaiming a brick from a wall someone else had tried to dismantle. At 8:47 a.m., the foundation became legally active. The workshop, the surrounding forest, and 12 acres of land were now part of an entity with one purpose: to remain what they were meant to be. Not a resort. Not a revenue stream. A legacy. I walked out of the office with the foundation documents tucked into a folder against my chest. Outside, the air felt sharper, almost clean. Driving home, I rehearsed nothing. I didn't need rehearsals anymore. What came next would unfold on its own. At 10:03, I heard the gravel shift outside. Their car doors shut in hurried succession. Through the window, I saw Omar striding up the walkway, jaw tight, shoulders high. Jade followed, her expression pinched with controlled irritation. Behind them came their partners, lingering near the mailbox, avoiding eye contact with each other. I didn't invite them in. I simply opened the door and stepped aside. They entered as if they still believed the house was halfway theirs. Their eyes scanned the living room quickly, as though measuring what was left to claim. "We need to talk," Omar said sharply. "Yes," I replied. "We do." Before he could continue, before Jade could begin her rehearsed reasoning, I placed the folder on the table and slid the top document toward them. They skimmed the heading, their brows furrowing in confusion first, then disbelief, then something darker. "What is this?" Jade asked, her voice tightening. "It's final," I said. "Harvey's workshop, the forest, and the land are now part of a community foundation. They're no longer private assets." Omar shook his head. "Mom, you don't understand what you've done." "I understand exactly," I replied. He opened his mouth again, but for the first time in months, his words didn't carry over mine. "You listed my property in your LLC without my consent," I continued. "You drafted transfer papers for me to sign during the reading of your father's will. You made plans for my home as though I were already gone. I'm simply placing boundaries you refused to respect." They stared at me as though seeing a stranger. Jade's partner took a small step back. Omar's partner looked toward the door. "You're sabotaging your own future," Jade whispered. "No," I said. "I'm protecting it." Silence settled into the room, thick, stunned, almost echoing. The clock ticked behind us, the hidden camera capturing everything with its quiet, unblinking eye. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. "I won't be moved out of my life," I said softly. "Not by force. Not by pressure disguised as concern. Not by anyone." I picked up the folder again, closed it, and tucked it under my arm. They left without another word. And I closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place like a promise I intended to keep. The fallout began faster than I expected, though not in the dramatic way movies like to show. It unfolded quietly, almost politely, like a door closing with a soft click instead of a slam. The announcement came through Mr. Kelman first. He insisted that the children, their partners, and I meet at his office again in the afternoon. I arrived early. They arrived late. When they walked in, they carried a kind of urgent confidence, still believing they could fix things with pressure, persuasion, or the sheer force of their expectations. But the moment Mr. Kelman opened the folder and read the words aloud, "The land now belongs to a charitable foundation. It cannot be sold, divided, or redeveloped." The air shifted. Jade was the first to react. Her face drained so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. She blinked, staring at the document as though trying to decode a language she had never heard before. Her fingers curled slightly, digging into her skirt as if bracing against a sudden fall. Omar flushed deep red. A slow rising heat that climbed from his neck to his temples. His jaw clenched. He didn't look at me. He looked at the attorney, as though searching for a loophole in a room that had none. "You're telling me," he said tightly, "that the land is gone? Just like that?" "It's not gone," Mr. Kelman replied calmly. "It has been preserved. which is what your mother has chosen. Their partners exchanged glances, long, quiet ones. I caught the moment when the brightness in their eyes dimmed, replaced by calculation. They had been promised something. They had imagined investors, revenue, a project grand enough to post about. And now, with one sentence, that imagined future had slipped from their grasp. Within days, the consequences spread. The partners who once hovered so eagerly around Omar and Jade began stepping back. Phone calls were returned late. Messages became shorter. Meetings were postponed, then canceled. The tone shifted, from enthusiasm to mild apology to careful distance. One evening, I overheard a conversation outside the grocery store. Not intentionally, I simply happened to walk past two women from town. "Did you hear about the Davis kids?" one whispered. "The ones who tried to get their mother to sign over everything," the other replied, shaking her head. "Shameful. Everyone's talking about it." Rumors moved through the community like wind through leaves, quiet, steady, impossible to stop. Not exaggerated, not embellished. Just the simple truth spoken aloud. At church, I noticed how people greeted me with gentle warmth and greeted Omar and Jade with polite caution. Not cruelly, just differently. A shift in temperature. A change in the weather around them. 2 weeks later, Omar tried to salvage Eco Haven. He attempted to pitch the project to investors using alternative properties, but the momentum had died. Without the Davis land, a centerpiece, a selling point, the proposal fell flat. One by one, the investors backed out. The documents he had prepared so confidently were returned with curt emails. "We will not be moving forward." Jade's situation changed too. Her design partners had been counting on her involvement with the retreat concept. Once they learned the project had dissolved, they restructured without her. Her name disappeared quietly from the group website. She despised silence, but silence surrounded her. The foundation, meanwhile, began taking shape. Word spread quickly that Harvey's workshop would become a woodworking program for local teens. Donations arrived before I even asked for them. Veterans groups reached out about using the forest trails for rehabilitation hikes. Former students of mine wrote letters offering to volunteer. It grew, steadily, quietly, and with a kind of grace that felt like Harvey's hand guiding mine. Omar and Jade visited less frequently. Their pride wouldn't allow them to apologize, and their plans no longer included me. Every time they came, they looked around the house differently, not with hunger but with discomfort, as if they no longer recognized the place they had once tried to claim. One afternoon, Omar stood in the doorway, staring at the workshop through the window. "You really did it," he said. Not accusing, not angry, just stunned. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once, unable to keep eye contact, then stepped back as though the threshold itself pushed him away. The consequences didn't roar. They whispered. They arrived naturally, as all honest reckonings do. I didn't celebrate their losses. That's not in my nature. But I did feel something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, but certainty. A quiet, steady certainty that comes when the truth finally finds its place in the open, and everyone must live with it. In the weeks that followed, the house began to feel different, not because anything changed in its structure, but because something inside me finally had. I woke earlier, breathed deeper, moved with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. The shadows that once clung to the corners began to lift. It was as if the walls, long pressed by tension and silent worry, exhaled with me. The first thing I did was open all the curtains. Light poured into rooms that had been dim for too long. I dusted shelves, rearranged small things, added new plants to the windowsills. The house didn't need transformation. It needed reclaiming. The simple act of choosing where a chair sat or what hung on a wall felt like stitching myself back into my own home. I walked into Harvey's workshop one morning with a broom, and left 3 hours later with a renewed sense of purpose. The space that had once been his sanctuary became something larger, something alive again. I cleared the workbench, sorted tools, polished the cedar shelves he'd carved. The smell of sawdust and oil rose warmly around me, grounding me like nothing else could. 2 days later, a group of local teens from a community program arrived. 5 of them, unsure and wide-eyed. They touched the tools reverently, whispering to each other as if they'd stepped into a sacred place. I taught them how to sand a board, how to hold a chisel correctly, how to respect the grain of wood. Their concentration reminded me of my early years teaching school. when a child's spark of understanding could brighten an entire day. They came back the next week. Then the week after. Soon the workshop filled with low laughter, sawdust, music from someone's small speaker. The space that once carried the weight of loss began carrying purpose again. I felt Harvey in those mornings, not as a ghost but as a quiet warmth, a hand on my shoulder, a steadying presence in the rhythm of the work. The forest became a healing place as well. A veterans group reached out after hearing about the foundation. They asked if they could walk the trails as part of their rehabilitation program. The first morning they came, the early air was still cool, the leaves damp from overnight mist. I watched them move slowly through the trees, some with canes, some with careful steps, all of them carrying stories heavier than their packs. I didn't talk much. I simply walked a little way behind them, listening to the crunch of leaves and the occasional low murmur of conversation. When they reached the clearing where the light falls just right between the branches, some stood silently, eyes closed, breathing deeply. One man came toward me afterward, his voice quiet. "This place feels gentle," he said. Gentle. Yes, that was the word I hadn't been able to find. Later that week, I repainted the living room walls the soft cream color Harvey always liked. I replaced a broken lamp, changed the slipcovers, cleaned out a drawer of papers I'd avoided for months. While sorting through them, I found a photograph of Harvey and me taken the year we built the deck. Him sunburned, me laughing, sawdust in both our hair. I framed it and set it on the entry table. Not as a shrine but as a reminder. We built this life together and I was still living it. I kept expecting the children to return, to argue again or try once more to change my mind. But they didn't. Their visits became infrequent, polite, brief. They sat on the edge of the couch instead of sinking into it, spoke in measured tones instead of confident ones. It wasn't closeness, but it was distance without intrusion. A kind of truce. And in that space something finally settled. The house was no longer a battleground. The land was no longer a point of negotiation. The workshop was no longer caught between grief and threat. It was useful, alive. Exactly what Harvey would have wanted. Teenagers learning. Veterans healing. Sawdust in the air again. One evening as I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, I realized I had not checked my phone all day. No tension pulled at my shoulders. No dread sat in my stomach. The trees rustled softly in the breeze, and the sky stretched wide above me. It was simple and it was enough. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't waiting for anyone to apologize or return to who they used to be. I wasn't grieving the old life anymore. I was living a new one. A quieter one. A smaller one. But one that belonged wholly to me. And in that gentleness, I found something I didn't know I had been missing. Myself. In the quiet of early evening, I sometimes sit by the workshop door and listen to the sounds drifting from inside. Sandpaper against wood, low voices, the gentle shuffle of feet. It reminds me that a life can be rebuilt without noise or grand gestures. Just steady choices made one honest moment at a time. I think of Harvey often, not with the ache that once hollowed me, but with a calm gratitude. I protected what he loved, and in doing so I found a steadiness I thought I had lost. Losing my children's closeness still stings. I won't pretend it doesn't. But I've learned that affection forced into silence is not love, and loyalty demanded through fear is not family. What remains now is quieter, smaller, but true. My days are filled with people who choose kindness without expecting ownership, and that has become its own kind of inheritance. I used to believe home was something you held together with patience and sacrifice. Now I understand it is something you safeguard with clarity. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors you keep locked until someone knocks with respect. If this touched a familiar nerve in you, then you belong here. Stay with me and subscribe if you wish. This is a place where silence becomes strength.